Welcome, everybody. My name is Fuad Maki, and I currently serve as Director of the Polson Institute for Global Development, which is sponsoring this afternoon's event on the subject of how we might more critically conceptualize the complex of forces, mechanisms, dynamics that have generated what has come to be known as the Anthropocene, a new planetary epoch in which what we are facing is not only an environmental crisis, but is considered to be a geological revolution of human origin. But before delving into that, I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gaia-Kono, which is the Cayuga Nation. The Gaia-Kono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gaia-Kono. This possession and honors the ongoing connection of the Gaia-Kono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Today, as of course most of you know, April 22nd is Earth Day, which is since 1970 has served as a symbolic date to renew our commitment to building a more sustainable future. And it is in that spirit that we have organized the conversation today. We are particularly delighted to have 2 distinguished panelists who each in their own way have made significant contributions to a critical understanding of the global crisis we find ourselves in today. Wendy Wolford is the Robert A. and Ruth E. Polson Professor of Global Development in the Department of Global Development. Her research spans the fields of international development, land use and distribution, social mobilization, agrarian change, and critical ethnography. She's also Vice Provost for International Affairs at Cornell, where she has done much to strengthen the university's global connections and interdisciplinary initiatives. Wendy holds a PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley, and is the author of numerous publications, including most recently, the Plantationocene, a Lusotropical Contribution to the Theory, published in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, which was served as the framing centerpiece of a conversation that was held almost a year ago, exactly a year ago actually, where more than 40 panelists and participants from around the world came together for a 2-day virtual conference to explore the role that plantations and plantation agriculture have played in shaping the nature, structure, and dynamics of the modern era. Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he is professor of sociology. Professor Moore is the author or editor of numerous publications, including most recently, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which is published in 2017, and co-authored with Raj Patel. Jason is the recipient of various awards, including the 2003 Alice Hamilton Prize of the American Society for Environmental History and the 2011 Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Change. He also serves as a coordinator of the World Ecology Research Network. The format for this afternoon's webinar is that each one of them will have about 25 minutes to give us a kind of their own reflections on the topic of the webinar. And then we will devote about, in the second part, about 15 minutes where they will have an opportunity to pose questions to each other, and maybe if depending on the dynamic and flow of the conversation, jointly explore topics that they find critical. The last part then will be when we'll open up to the audience for comments and questions. And there are different ways you can do that. You can either post your question on the chat function or the question and answer function, or you can raise your hands, and where pertinent, we can call on you to pose your own questions. Ideally, it's better, I think, given the size of the audience this afternoon, if you actually write your questions in either in the chat or the question and answer function. Okay, with that, I would like to welcome all of you, and especially our panelists. Thank you.
Should I take it away?
Yes, yes, sir.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much, Fuad. Thank you, Wendy, for agreeing to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to a radically honest conversation appropriate to times of profound crisis, but what kind of crisis? And that is something that we should really dig into. So let's just get right into it. Why the Capitalocene thesis? Well, because without a method to investigate and interpret the origins of planetary crisis and its developmental patterns over the longue durée, mainstream environmentalism will continue to be a politics of failure embedded in a de facto support for American imperialism, as it has been from the first Earth Day 52 years ago. People forget this, but a week later, President Nixon orders South Vietnamese and American forces into Laos and Cambodia, setting off a firestorm of unrest in the United States. And the whole Earth Day infrastructure that had mobilized 20 million people a week before sat on its hands, sat on its sidelines, and continued to do so really to this day when it comes to American neoliberal imperialism, both by economic means, as in its support for NAFTA, and its de facto support for or silence about American regime change politics, from US support for death squad fascism across the third world to today's regime change politics. So we want to have a serious historical investigation of the origins of crisis and to look what is and what is not there in the post-1968 environmental imaginary. So since then, the dominant view of the crisis, really today and then, remains remarkably similar. True, the crazy populationists have, to some degree, been sidelined. In its place is an embrace of an abstract industrialism. Al Gore called it our industrial civilization, now coupled with wild enthusiasm for green austerity, sometimes known as degrowth, and an incipient but powerful form of techno-scientific green authoritarianism. So from the first Earth Day, environmentalism, let me call it the environmentalism of the rich, bore all the imprints of an alliance between the political elites, the media propaganda complex, and the professional classes, sometimes then is now called the professional managerial class. This environmentalism had little in common with the era's working class, anti-imperial and anti-racist struggles, a line advanced by Martin Luther King before he was killed by the US security state in Memphis on April 4, 1968. Environmentalism, this environmentalism of the rich, is often called a movement, but it is a movement that is, to quote the great muckraking journalist James Ridgway, one whose ideology was cooked up in a lab and whose sense of political action was to legislate from the courtroom. So from the beginning, this environmental imaginary of the rich had little interest in history. This should not surprise us. To see the world in terms, and I quote the Anthropocene headline of humans overwhelming the great forces of nature, is to see the world in a thoroughly modern, thoroughly imperialist, thoroughly bourgeois way. Of all the ruling abstractions nurtured by the civilizing project since 1492, none are bloodier than those of man, nature, and civilization. These are not just ideas, these are real ideological ruling ideas that have shaped the world that we inhabit. The rise and development of capitalism, therefore, has been premised on a unique form of what the great socialist feminist thinker Ines King called human sacrifice, the expulsion of the vast majority of humankind from civilized society. Such fetishes are, well, like all fetishes, ahistorical, even when they evoke past events. That is to say, they ignore precisely what the Capitalocene thesis insists upon: the investigation and interpretation of the origins of planetary crisis, its turning points, its phases of development. Sometimes people call this world historical emphasis abstract. In my view, world history is, well, anything but abstract. It is anything but the general context for specific regional developments. The history of capitalism shows us as much. The sine qua non of the capitalist world ecology is its developmental patterns that mobilize and entwine relations of power, profit, and life in the most intimate and the most expansive ways. From the beginning, capitalism joined the transformation of the body and the biosphere. We can pretend that capitalism has no historical tendencies, secular trends, patterns, imperatives, but that will not protect us from its ecocidal and genocidal violence that indeed concentrates at particular scales with a particular sense of geographical possibility in forming imperial class capacities. Nor will it inform a planetary justice that must be of necessity internationalist if we are to confront the biospheric dictatorship of capital and its willingness, well, to borrow a phrase from 1968, to destroy the village in order to save it. In recent years, there has emerged, well, a scene mania. There are over 80 of them. Some are playful, some are sectarian, many are explicitly hostile to what the Capitalocene and its twofold commitment seeks to do. That is, on the one hand, to naming the system of power, profit, and life that has been a geobiological and class force since 1492, and to investigating and interpreting the origins of planetary crisis as the origins of capitalism. This is the flight from world history. And it's commonplace in many of these themes, but the popular Anthropocene above all. I have no quibble with the geologists, although I do take a side with Maslin and Lewis on the Anthropocene event and the Orbis spike, but that's a completely different question. We're dealing with geohistory. And the flight from history in these arguments, the popular Anthropocene, and an effort to conceptualize the historical origins and development of planetary crisis, really the arguments are more or less twofold. One is an empiricist assertion that world history is diverse and therefore cannot be grasped in its combined and uneven patterns. The second is an ideological claim that any attempt to narrate capitalism's differentiated unity is irremediably Eurocentric. And this turns on an unfortunate and I think politically disabling conflation of a reified Europe with historical capitalism. The crux of all of the scene mania and so much of critical theory these days, I think is again, quite politically disabling, that what we see is a tendency to redefine the interpretive debate. And this is on every critique of the Capitalocene thesis that I've really looked at, away from the real ground of world historical turning points, which of course is what it's all about, and towards philosophical and conceptual propositions removed from these turning points and patterns. So dropped from the frame is really a debate over when do we see the rise of capitalism, when do we see the origins of planetary crisis, and what are its class and imperial and ideological dynamics. Well, I think that one of historical materialism's greatest contributions is its interpretive power to demystify the bourgeoisie's ruling abstractions in service to socialist revolution. So these ruling abstractions, man, nature, civilization, of course, these emerge very, very early and can be thought of as the kind of ideological trinity that then creates something we can call bourgeois naturalism. That naturalism is then taken up into the ideological and class churn of the racial and gendered constructions of the post-1570 era, the drawing of the world color line, the drawing of what I will call climate patriarchy after 1550. And so what historical materialism allows us to do is to see the concrete interpenetration of everyday life between the structures of capital, the structures of feeling, and the structures of power in a multi-layered and combined and uneven way. Let's do away with this sort of post-structural conceit that Marxism is just another form of modernism, and recognize that dialectics always unfolds through, not in spite of, diversity and variation. So for Marx and Engels, this globalization of capital, in the sense that I've just outlined, was irreducibly shaped by what they call a twofold relation of class society. It was not only socio-ecological at every turn, but premised on an active materialism through which class society is at once unevenly producer and product of webs of life. That insight is at the core of the world ecology conversation. My argument on that point has been straightforward. Identifying, interpreting, and reconstructing the origins and development of planetary crisis is among the world left's most fundamental political tasks. Virtually everything about climate justice politics today turns on one's conception of world history, whether it's explicit or not. Ahistorical thinking is, well, almost guaranteed to reproduce the bourgeoisie's ruling ideas. The second wave environmentalism after 1968, for instance, was hostage to the dominant fetishes of the 19th century of populationism, industrialism, scientism, and so forth. It was, and sadly still is, an outlook strongly predisposed to technocratic and technological fetishes and to ignoring imperial power and environmental problems faced by workers and peasants around the world. The Capitalocene alternative, of course, foregrounds the Plantation Revolution, something that has somehow gotten lost in the mix of these discussions. And emphasizing the Plantation Revolution, its commodity frontiers, its civilizing project, especially racialization on both sides of the Atlantic, and its environment-making revolution in the context of modern imperialism. It has done so from the beginning and with increasing force since 2015. Those who are interested, for instance, can look at my 2018 essay on slave ship Earth. In contrast to the current fashion of rereading colonialism, the Capitalocene thesis insists, incidentally, may I add, with the strange bedfellows of people like C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson, and W.E.B. Du Bois, that imperialism and the plantation revolutions were engines of class formation, of proletarianization and bourgeoisification. From these dynamics emerged successive racial formations on a world scale after 1570. That's no footnote to the climate crisis today, which is the result, not the consequence of, which is the result rather of the capitalogenic trinity forged between 1550 and 1700, that of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, and climate patriarchy. A fateful collision, we are told, shapes modern world history from the standpoint of the popular Anthropocene. This is humans overwhelming the great forces of nature. There's no stronger statement of whitewashing capital's responsibility for a capitalogenic crisis. The popular Anthropocene, along with many critical theories and their scenes, find common ground in this philosophy of external relations. You have a collision of man and nature. This is deeply disabling to understanding the actual contours of the climate crisis, and it leads to unfortunate statements like human-made climate change is the driver of X, Y, or Z. No, first of all, it's not human-made, it's capital-made. It's not anthropogenic, it's capitalogenic. And that kind of specificity is absolutely crucial. We can only do that by piercing the veil of these ruling abstractions of man, nature, development, civilization, et cetera, from the very beginning. So let's state the obvious, that the relations between the origins of a world historical problem, its historical development, and its recent configurations of power, profit, and life are very intimate. One's assessment of those relations feeds more or less directly into one's assessment of the politics necessary to address the climate crisis. So let me begin with a thumbnail hypothesis and elaborate that with the time that I have left. The origins of a new pattern of environment making began in the Atlantic world during the long 16th century. Why is this not merely a historical problem, but also a political one? Well, to locate the origins of the modern world with the steam engine and the coal pit is to prioritize shutting down the steam engines and the coal pits and their 21st century incarnations. To locate the origins of the modern world with the rise of capitalist civilization after 1450, with its audacious strategies of global conquest, endless commodification, relentless rationalization, and its binarized ideological constructs of man, nature, man, woman, white and not white, is to prioritize the relations of power, profit, and life that rendered fossil capitalism so deadly in the first place. Shut down a coal plant and you can slow global warming for a day. Shut down the relations that made the coal plant, you can stop it for good. And that indeed has to be our priority in the present moment. And instead, today's academic vogue is to join two, I think, largely incompatible theses, one about settler colonialism, the other about fossil capital. And neither of them seem to have a lot of concern for the history of what's called the Industrial Revolution, which really should just be called the era of cotton mechanization. And if we want to look at the true industrial revolution, we would look either earlier or later or both. In any event, as many of you know, my position for the past 25 years or so has been that early 19th century industrialization is just one of many industrializations, that it was specifically the outcome of class, industrial, imperial, and environment making dynamics related strongly to the early modern plantation revolution. Nevertheless, still to this day, to make this argument is to swim against the current, even of radical and critical thought. Virtually all environmental thinking and social theory says that all the trouble started in England with the advent of coal and steam. Such periodization matters terrifically to our politics today. For one, this narrative, a very old narrative, reveals a long-held love affair with big machines. The old Anglo-centric reading of capitalism has the disabling effect of rendering slavery, racism, colonialism, sexism all secondary. We are back to the old forces of production argument. This is the fossil capital thesis, by the way, which I think could be retooled in some interesting ways. And it is also the history of the influence of man, nature, civilization, society as real abstractions, limiting the radical thinking and radical critique of bourgeois ideology. Let me say it's not even clear that the steam engine was the key machine of the industrialization of the early 19th century. Was not the cotton gin arguably more pivotal? Marx thought so. He observed that it was only the enormous fall in the price of cotton that made large-scale industry possible. This is no mere historical quibble, for the productivist strategy and the civilizing project of society and nature lends itself quite readily to the view of race and gender as dependent variables, forgetting, as Silvia Federici reminds us, that the violent binaries of race and gender were themselves strategic levers of the production of surplus value. That is, bringing in, as I've argued, as Federici has argued to great effect, the centrality of unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature, of what I would call the femitariat and biotariat as mutually constituting and shifting and overlapping, interpenetrating moments of the planetary proletariat. But of course, none of these binaries of man, nature, civilization, race, gender were invented in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, if we keep the term, depended on those. So I've written with Raj Patel a book that stresses the significance of the era of 1492. But really, if we want to understand the origins of this capitalogenic trinity of the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid, we need to go to what Ladouret and Doe call the long, cold 17th century. And this sets in, as you can, in the 1550s and 1560s. It was really a perfect storm because changes in the North Atlantic oscillation from positive to negative were later reinforced by the Orbis spike, a cheap labor slaving-induced genocide, and then, of course, volcanic activity right around 1600. But this was also the era in which Charles V's effort to transform capitalism into a world empire had thoroughly exhausted itself. The Portuguese were exhausted fiscally, the Spanish were too. And what did they do after 1549? Between 1549 and, well, the next decade, when the great bankruptcies and financial crises hit, both empires begin to assume a more intense imperial control in order directly to nurture, encourage, and enable vast commodity producing revolutions. In the case of northeastern Brazil, sugar; in the case of colonial Peru, silver. Oh, by the way, those were the two hotspots or flashpoints of the New World genocides, as well as Alexander Koch and Maslin and Lewis and others have recently demonstrated. So it was at this time in the middle of the 16th century that signs of a climate downturn first became evident. The climate conditions deteriorated rapidly after 1600. And for the most part, this was a natural forcing event, but it was also the first capitalogenic event created by the slaving-induced genocides in the New World. I want to underline that point. This was not microbial determinism. This was not, whoops, the microbes would have killed everyone. No, they would have killed maybe 25, 30% of the population, which would be horrific, but they would not have killed 95% of the population, which then had terrific impact on planetary climate. at the heart of what Jeffrey Parker calls the global climate. And that's important because this era of the long, cold 17th century is when we get the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and the world color line. The world color line, of course, begins in a very tentative way in the 1570s and doesn't really mature until about a century later, although we see early glimpses of it in the response to, say, alliances between indigenous and slaves in northeastern Brazil in the 1590s and all of that. But what we see in this era was a partly induced capitalogenic climate crisis, and B, a climate fix. A climate fix was essentially to drive hard and fast to frontiers of cheap nature to secure cheap food, cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and cheap energy of every kind. It wasn't centered it wasn't limited rather to the New World. It also had decisive moments across Europe, as I've shown. And what's crucial to remember is that the climate conditions of this era were those that had essentially brought down the Roman West in the 4th and 5th centuries and feudal Europe in the 14th and 15th century for distinctive reasons, but nevertheless, periods of dramatically unfavorable climate change across the past 2-3 millennia have been very, very bad for ruling classes, have been moments of extraordinary war, social unrest, political unrest, and all the rest. So we have to understand that capitalism as we've known it takes shape out of this climate crisis of the long, cold 17th century. And it's here, of course, that we see the full bloom of the Plantation Revolution. And what we see here is long before the steamship could send guns and soldiers and accountants and bankers up the rivers of Africa, into up the rivers of China, into India, all these other places. Long before that was an environment-making revolution, unprecedented in human history in its scale, scope, and speed. And I've written quite a bit about this, so I'll just give you the barest sense of it, that what you have almost everywhere, from northeastern Brazil to the Baltic to Southeast Asia to the fishing grounds of Newfoundland, everywhere you see this extraordinary labor landscape revolution that had no precedent at all in the history of pre-modern civilizations. Pre-modern civilizations sometimes did bigger projects, the Great Wall, the pyramids, but nowhere did we see a civilization become a global environmental geobiological force, if you will, at this scale and on this speed. So the unprecedented character of this revolution is impossible to overstate. And I said frontiers, but let's remember, sometimes we call them commodity frontiers, but really they were imperial frontiers of militarized accumulation and the civilizing project that sought to establish the conditions for appropriating the unpaid work of, to quote Maria Mies, women, nature, and colonies. So this puts together as a differential unity the proletariat, femitariat, and biotariat in the rise of capitalism. This is the planetary proletariat. That there was, one way to put this, as Raj and I do in 7 Cheap Things, is for every great proletarianization, there's a great domestication. But there's also a great enclosure of extra-human life and the mobilization for free or low cost of its capacities to work for capital. And that's really, really fundamental because it brings together imperial power and science in its double register as force of production and as ideological mechanism. Of course, we live in an era where good science is invoked as the way to manage the biosphere in the interests of the 1%. Now, what I've said all here can be almost summarized in one line from the great Claudio von Berlehoff, that with the rise of capitalism, the invention of nature as a real abstraction became this kind of dynamic. Nature, she says, became everything the bourgeoisie did not want to pay for. And so there's a lot that I can go through, but when we think about the Plantation Revolution and as an engine of proletarianization, as C.L.R. James and Cedric Robinson and many other people have insisted, that we are looking at the normal state of proletarianization in the capitalist world ecology, which is always semi-proletarianization, which always relies on even greater contributions of unpaid work. Again, from the femitariat and biotariat. And if we don't have a climate justice that will be able to put those together, we're back in the bind of the second and third internationals, never mind the dismal and utter failure of modern environmentalism, to be unable to put these questions of work and power, of capital and civilizing projects, above all the critique of ideology, together in some very, very robust ways. Now, what we want to, let's end on this because we're out of time, that we can recognize that no civilization has been more Promethean in its aspirations than capitalism. Prometheanism has no more to do with man than it does to do with nature. It is the justification of a super exploitation project that begins with turning webs of extra human life into profit-making opportunities and moves very, very quickly through imperial bourgeois naturalism to create new categories of oppression around race and gender that are fundamental to the accumulation of capital, that are fundamental to the dynamics of class formation and, yes, class struggle on a world scale. And so what we are looking at in the present moment is the challenge really of a very old question on the left, which is how to forge internationalist alliances against the managerial technocratic impulse of, of planetary management. And this is the chart, this is the road charted by the World Economic Forum, the Davos Project, the Great Reset, all of this, which has actually quite terrifying implications, but it's deeply rooted in the managerial outlook of modern environmentalism since 1970. So what is the challenge today? The challenge is to go back and to understand this capitalogenic trinity and as the combined and uneven unity of the planetary proletariat, of capital, of the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid, and to look at that seriously so that we understand with Martin Luther King that an injury to one is an injury to all, and that these triple evils of militarism, militarism and imperialism, racism and class exploitation are always within webs of life. So to conclude, that the challenge here before us is to forge international alliances, but not on the ad hoc basis that this sort of democratic theory of causation, race, class, gender, but we're not actually going to reconstruct the history. We're going to, the alternative is to look at race, class, gender as dialectically bound from the beginning, but not all starting at the same time, that there's a logic and a sequence of historical unevenness and combination that we have to look at very seriously in order to understand the possibilities of the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, for that forceful presentation. So we'll now move on to Wendy.
Thanks, Fuad, and thanks, Jason, very much. It's a real pleasure to get to be here. It's nice to have a conversation with Jason, even though I feel very far away, which is nice because we can have this audience here. But I do hope people from the audience will jump in and comment. I think that when Fuad pulled this together, he probably imagined that Jason and I would have more to disagree about than we might. So the audience might have to jump in to make the disagreement for us, because I think there's a lot of overlap in the way that we're understanding the sort of articulation of crises today, the environmental crisis being one of those, but also the need for a historical analysis of how we got to where we are and the different elements or dynamics of that crisis. In quotes, because we understand crises to be elements that we need to pull apart and define. So the topics we're discussing today are serious, but I want to start with a joke that Brazilians tell about themselves that I'm adapting here today. And it begins with the making of the world. So it's an appropriate story to start off with when talking about the world-making work of plantations. And as the story goes, the supreme being was creating our planet as they created all planets, and they put in these beautiful oceans, green forests, vibrant savannas, and these glorious mountains that reached all the way from the ocean floor to the sky. And the other beings who were involved in this world-making project all gathered around and they protested and they said, but look what you're putting on this planet when the other planets are nothing but gas or full of rocks and craters. It's too beautiful, it isn't fair. And the supreme being says, pointing to Earth, don't worry, wait until you see the people I'm going to put there. And it's funnier when Brazilians tell it the way I told it, it's just sad, but the story sort of gets at, I think, an analysis maybe of the Anthropocene, or the way in which the concept of the Anthropocene is used. And I agree very much with Jason's critique of that concept. But the story also gets at the crises that Fuad mentioned in his introduction. So everything from climate change, desertification, wildfires, oceanic plastic, melting ice caps, and gross inequality, poverty, systemic racism, sexual violence, ethnic hatred, demonization of the other, hunger, war, weapons of mass destruction, and more. We seem almost hell-bent on creating a planet as inhospitable to life as Mars or Jupiter. The concept of the Anthropocene, I think, and I think I heard Jason say this too, has helped to expand the audience, right? It's helped to increase the numbers or increase those who are thinking about contemporary ecological crises from a clearly human-centered perspective. But because the concept is a descriptive one, it leaves out the most important things. It doesn't help us to understand how we got here, which would require differentiating the who and why, the where, or under what conditions and when. So a lot of that is this historical analysis of the modern moment that Jason refers to. Many scholars have said this, and there are a lot of critiques of the Anthropocene, but the concept separates humans from nature and then contradictorily suggests that the destruction of nature by humans is a product essentially of human nature, or the natural desire to truck, barter, and trade. Perhaps most importantly, in leaving out the why and the how, the Anthropocene also leaves out the why and the how not. In other words, it can't help us to explain, understand, or foster the many forms and spaces of resistance around the world or the production of alternatives. So Jason talked about the concept of the Capitalocene, which he's written about and just spoken about very eloquently, and I want to focus instead on the Plantationocene. As Fuad said, today is Earth Day, but just 5 days ago, April 17th, it was International Peasants' Day. That's celebrated on April 17th every year because of the bloodshed of peasants in rural Brazil 2+ decades ago. And it is symbolic of this bloodshed through time and across the globe. I think many have posited this idea, including myself, of the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene as maybe mutually exclusive, or at least either or, one being better than the other. But I do think it's perhaps more productive, as Dale Tomich and others argue, to think of plantations and capitalism as historically intertwined and mutually reinforcing. And Jason refers to this also in his opening comments. And I would suggest, and this is really the point of these opening comments, that framing the Capitalocene as a Plantationocene centers relations that are crucial. So a number of things that Jason sort of said, those are elements that you can get to through world ecology, but I think really centering them through the object of the plantation, meaning particularly the multi-species ecology, racism, violence, sexual extraction, coloniality, territoriality, ambivalence, and resistance. And particularly the always surprising to many, the still surprising strength of peasant or rural resistance, much of which is articulated in opposition to plantations or to plantation dominance. So I think a focus on the plantation helps to explain the durability of those dynamics and focuses one's attention on the brutality of the modern period. There aren't any, as far as I know, game theories or economic models that can paper over the naked force and the devastating simplifications of the plantation. if I asked most Cornell undergraduate students what they think about capitalism, they would have very positive things to say, right? It makes sense. This is the common sense of their time and of the last 300, 400 years, but the plantation disrupts that. I think there are very few people, other than those who have their weddings on plantations, but there are very few people who can ignore the blood of enslaved labor and the ruin of landscapes. So for me, the plantation is actually quite an important political intervention, perhaps with the Capitalocene. But a little bit of explanation to start, and I see a comment in the question and answer, a little bit of explanation to start. The Plantationocene, most of you will know, but it's a fairly recent concept. It was first suggested by Donna Haraway and Anna Singh in a conversation that was organized by Greg Mittman and others at the University of Wisconsin. I mean, it's not more than 5 or 6 years old. And the argument is essentially that the modern era has been so fundamentally shaped by the plantation that we can understand it best as the Plantationocene. So it is a deeply historic and very grounded understanding of the current moment and the modern era writ large. Plantations are defined as large-scale, monocrop or single product production units historically dependent on enslaved or forced labor. There are differences, of course, in every place, but they are designed for extraction from the local site, self-reproducing but incomplete without that market exchange. Dispossession has been historically and analytically key to bringing land and labor together in plantations, although again, the ways in which this has been done are historically and geographically specific so that plantation communities, products, and markets look different across time and place. At the same time, the plantation as an ideal represents a model of, and even an imperative for, production that has essential similarities across space. Historically and today, plantations have wielded tremendous discursive power as idealized landscapes of production, profit, and property, or orderly and organized nature. The concept of the Plantationocene, like I said, started in this initial conversation with Haraway and Singh, and almost playfully, just as a, why don't we call it the Plantationocene? But of course, it only gained traction and only sort of resonates, I think, with a broader group because it builds on a long tradition and long history of plantation studies, and very much related to that, a long history of agrarian studies. So there's disagreement over whether the concept of a Plantationocene is useful. And even in that group that Fuad mentioned that we brought together a year ago in the Einaudi Center, maybe there were 40 or so speakers and probably half of them would have argued that the Plantationocene was too ambitious, and in a similar way as the Capitalocene, aggressively encompassing, right? And so this is maybe a disagreement with Jason in terms of what is the relevance of different perspectives and different trajectories, right? But many of the people who are at the conference who are in agrarian studies and who really take the local and specific relations between people within communities and between people and the land to be important, that term is challenging or problematic. I think whether or not you find the term useful depends in part on the work that you think theoretical concepts should do. I think a good theoretical concept has to be able to help us understand actually existing dynamics and relations, right? So that wouldn't be different than Jason. It has to be able to clarify seeming contradictions and resonate with lived experiences. A good concept is usually, we don't always like to admit this, prefigured by actors and actions on the ground, in the sense that we're always a step behind. We're trying to understand what happens. And it should help us to recognize, analyze, and expand the space for emergent alternatives. To me, the Plantationocene is productive in all of those ways. But I do think it's important to say that as powerful as it is for analytical and political purposes, it is a concept, not a theory, I would say. And as such, the measure of its worth shouldn't be whether it can explain everything everywhere equally. And maybe that's an argument for, in some way, understanding the Plantationocene in connection with the Capitalocene. It could also be an argument for not having an all-encompassing theoretical framework that purports to explain everything, but we could talk about that more. My own work, as many of you will know, is grounded particularly in what I call the Lusotropics, but I say that knowing that the term the Lusotropics has its own difficult political history. I particularly began with work on land tenure and politics in the early 1990s when I went to Brazil to work with the grassroots social movement, the Brazilian Movement of Rural Landless Workers, or the MST. The MST is almost 50 years old now, which that'll make you feel old, right? The MST is almost 50 years old now, and it's been fighting over these past 5 decades to break up large-scale estates in Brazil to distribute the land to the rural poor. Doing so, breaking up these estates, would correct one of the greatest injustices in the country's history, the unequal land ownership, whereby these colonial hereditary allotments favored a small handful of Portuguese military and feudal elites, creating a plantation aristocracy 5 centuries and strong of agro-export dependency and hierarchical patron-client relations between social classes. In Brazil, plantations, from sugarcane to coffee to now the new very large-scale soybean plantations in the center west, they've dominated the society, politics, and economy in ways that are very similar to the second site in which my work is grounded, Mozambique. In Mozambique, plantations have been idealized, although not always realized, not as successfully as in Brazil, and that comes to play a role later on, not always realized, but have been part of the landscape since the Portuguese began their colonial project in Mozambique in earnest in the early 1900s. In this country, what was a territory, colony, and country, plantations haunt rather than occupy the landscape. They reappear regularly as the novel, ambitious solution to underdevelopment and poverty, despite their historical catastrophic failures that have been present through colonization, through what we could call the royal company feudalism, through capitalism, and through the brief experiment with socialism. Plantations were the mechanism of advancing across frontiers in and between these countries, so between Brazil and Africa most recently, generating waves of dispossession, of landlessness and migration that transformed rural insecurity into urban informality. In both countries, still to this day, the power of the plantation as an aspiration is impressive. There's this longing for plantations and plantation machinery, the tractor, which are seen as the height of orderly modern agricultural production, where man can command production and profit over nature. Okay, I think I'm going on too long, but I have some more to say. So I think it's important to examine this concept of the Plantationocene on and across 3 different levels, the micro, the meso, and the macro levels. And I will say that in our work on this, and I'm working with a group of colleagues and scholars in Brazil in particular, there are ways in which there are micro level studies that, or scholars who would argue that the meso level of course makes sense in particular places, but still the macro level is not, the Plantationocene, making that 3rd step to the macro level isn't as productive. So I just want to, because of that, specify the micro, meso, and macro level. At the micro level, like I said, there's this long and rich history of plantation scholarship focusing on the lives in and of single plantations or relatively contained plantation economies. In different regions of the world, the term plantation indexes local histories in ways that are very specific. So in the United States, of course, the plantation has a distinct historical and social place as co-constructing the US South, slavery, and the Confederacy. In Africa and Asia, plantations were at the heart of colonial rule, whether in the form of royal concessions or private companies, but the nature of the economy and of the rule was shaped, of course, by imperial power, by the commodity, by differentiated internal relations between groups living on the land and between those groups and the colonial powers. And it also depended on the form of colonial intervention, whether settler, indirect, corporate, or effectively mercantile. In Brazil and in Latin America more broadly, work in agrarian studies on large estates is generally not framed in the language of plantations. So it's been really interesting talking with scholars across Brazil in particular about the Plantationocene. Not only does it not translate well, it's very awkward, but there is this simple linguistic difference that the term used in Brazil is latifundia and the term used in Spanish America is hacienda. These signified large estates distributed through colonial rule, often with associated labor tributes. These grounded studies, and I'll get into a little bit more about the sort of way in which we might think about these particular plantation forms in Latin America. But I just want to say that at the micro level, these grounded studies of plantations highlight both the violence of forced labor and also the way in which life on the land shapes lived experiences and a very particular moral economy. The capacity for self-reproduction, which derives from the labor that is bonded to the plantation on the one hand, and from the workers' access to a plot of land for their own subsistence on the other hand, this capacity for self-reproduction makes the plantation a deeply ambivalent space, as many authors have pointed out, and one that really bears a thorough excavation analytically as a unit. Drawing on Sylvia Wynter, Catherine McKittrick, and Sarah Beskey highlight the potential for the plot to provide a space for autonomy and resistance while also serving as a highly conservative force, bonding the fate of labor to the fate of the plantation. And so, as Ann Stoller says, the plot is both menace and mantle. And this ambivalence is important, and it resonates with broader debates in agrarian studies about the awkward political nature of the peasantry. It's important because it highlights the potential for and the challenges to resistance on and from the plantation. And I'm grateful to Liz Pickard, a PhD student in my department, for highlighting ambivalence in the work of Sylvia Wynter that we read earlier this semester. So attention to place and context at this micro level is crucial because it centers the lived experience of the land and the violence of the plantation as we step to the meso and the macro levels of analysis. And there are certainly scholars who would say that though that micro level is so specific that you can't make connections across the different plantation economies to say anything at a broader level. And I recognize that, but I would say that there are more similarities that are fruitful for analysis than the dangers of those simplification of the differences. At the meso level, and here I'm thinking of the regional scale, the analytical strength of the Plantationocene is in the analysis of the way in which plantation institutions, dynamics, and relationships have historically shaped national governance, state formation, labor relations, market exchange, and society. This meso level is not simply the sum of multiple individual plantations, but rather the assemblage of interests, actions, and institutions that constitute and define regional or national structures. At this scale, you can determine the influence of planter and plantation on the state and on regional markets. As Tanya Lee and Pooja Samedi have argued in their book Plantation Life, plantations are incomplete without the protection of the state because they're often not economically superior or even profitable on their own. And so they depend on the state to ensure land claims, whether through outright violence or paternalistic norms of care and authority, or historically, probably even more relevant, through the licit or legal manipulation of labor and property laws in favor of the planter class. So George Beckford's idea of a plantation economies in the Caribbean, or Catherine McKittrick's description of plantations as a meaningful conceptual palimpsest, or Lee and Samedi's invocation of Ann Stoller's imperial debris. They're all helpful for understanding the continuity of plantation relations at this mesoscale. The third level on which the concept of the Plantationocene operates is, of course, the macro or the global level. So the notion of a Plantationocene brings the world making of specific plantations to the world systems level, where plantations have been the justification and technique of colonial expansion, racialized labor and property regimes, and the conquest of new territory. Jason already said this, but it was in the context of feudalism, or the demise of feudalism in Europe, that plantations began their truly unprecedented global spread. This theft of land, along with the enslavement of life of both people and plants, would be repeated over and over again in the name of the plantations, or in the name of productivity and profit for colonial powers. There's a broader sense of the plantation resources supporting or underwriting the birth of industry and urban settlement, and even in Sidney Mintz's work, providing the model for factory and energy production. So I would argue that the plantation fed the first and second industrial revolutions, fostered the creation of a hierarchical world market, fostered the creation of a world market in which some produce raw materials, the periphery for a core, and also fueled some of the deadliest aspects of state socialism in the former Soviet Union and in China. So in this way, the idea of the Plantationocene is the idea that plantations have fundamentally shaped modern society and economy, dominating agricultural production, facilitating and motivating territorial conquest, and new development narratives of underemployment in rural areas and rural to urban migration. I have some things that I would like to say about how this played out, in particular in the more recent movement of Brazilian farmers to Mozambique, particularly where Brazilian farmers, and deeply embedded in a plantation society, quite logically saw Mozambique, and this is in the context of the most recent global land grab, saw Mozambique as the next frontier, right? And so an open or empty, mostly idle land for the building of new plantations or new plantation agriculture. So what you see in Mozambique in the 2000s, between 2010 to 2020, with the movement of Brazilian farmers and scientists to Mozambique, what you see are many similarities in terms of the production of knowledge and the production of dispossession and plantation land in Mozambique that you had in an early period in Brazil. But I won't go into that so much because of time. I think the global land grab, though, does really show at a global level how plantations are still the automatic response to concerns about scarcity, hunger, or environmental or resource degradation, right? So the search for the large-scale plantation continues as the search for the means of resourcing or subsidizing production. Okay, so that's just a discussion of the three levels on which the Plantationocene works. And in the rest of the time I have, I want to highlight a handful of things that I think about when I think about what is at stake in suggesting that there is a Plantationocene. So first, the Plantationocene does relocate the origins of modernity in the so-called periphery, in the colonies rather than in the center. And I know Jason suggested that this isn't important, but I think that moving the story of the modern era from the transition from feudalism to capitalism in England, the sort of classic origin story, to the brutal arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese in the New World, Africa and Asia, helps us to understand how modernity is constituted through plantation colonization and all that it brought with it. It's in the control laid down on the people and on the land and resources of the colonies that the logic of the modern era is constituted and unfolds. And I think that control is clear across the last 500-600 years, whether you're talking about capitalism or socialism. In Latin America, I said I was going to come back to this. I mentioned already the focus of agrarian scholars on latifundia and hacienda, and these institutions were the center of fierce debate over the regional economy, the nature of the Latin American regional economy. And the debate, part of the debate was whether Latin America could be characterized as feudal or capitalist. The stakes were pretty high because if you believed that there was a predominantly feudal society or economy and state, then a progressive transformation relied on developing a national bourgeoisie. But if you believed that Latin American societies were integrated into the world market from the beginning, then it was the market itself that was responsible for the region's underdevelopment. And what I want to just contribute is that historians who did careful work on local context, more at that micro and meso level, rejected both of these positions, right? The feudal and the capitalist one, arguing that Latin America was characterized by both modes of production, one in which feudal characteristics of a planter aristocracy and self-contained units of plantation production, reliant on peasant self-production, self-reproduction, and forced labor, were integrated into circuits of capital exchange and wage labor. This is the sort of feudal capitalist articulation that I think the Plantationocene captures so well. So the Plantationocene, in a sense, is, or the plantations themselves, are the articulation of multiple modes of production. Second, another element that the Plantationocene helps to illuminate is that it brings force and violence and racism to the fore, right? It isn't something that is part and parcel or part of the process in a way that's incidental. It's very much at the core of the modern era and at the core of plantation production. I don't even need to go into this, but plantations were rooted in dispossession and enslavement, and they continue to rely on coercion and force along racial lines. Colonization forcibly removed millions of people from their land, and this dependence on total control over the less than human became baked into planter mindsets. And because political control in so many places originated in control over land, this enslaver mentality influenced the formation of states, markets, and society. In Brazil, planters were so dependent on enslaved labor that even after abolition in 1888, they treated free laborers so poorly that other countries banned or discouraged their rural poor from emigrating to that country. So the way in which European notions of settlement came to be equated with civilization and whiteness, I think, is highlighted in thinking about the plantation as a watershed moment, as Judy Carney says, that normalized and naturalized what Catherine McKittrick calls this plantation logic. Placing the plantation at the core of the modern era also requires that we center what Brenna Bander calls racial regimes of ownership, contemporary structures and acts of racist violence that very much continue to this day, that should be seen not as inevitable, but as inherent in a system that was shaped by the forced labor of a plantation. Thinking with the plantation requires us, as Farhana Sultana said in an essay she just published on the unbearable heaviness of coloniality, it forces us to focus on the brutality of the lived experience and the everyday on plantations, whether one is following humans or non-humans. Third, plantations as inherently spatialized entities help us to understand territorialization. Plantations began as these aspirational mechanisms of territorial claiming, and they flourished as the means for provisioning a growing demand for tropical commodities. They're very much connected to tropes of improvement, and this idea of plantations and an aspiration for territorial control continues today. Again, sort of as I pointed out, with the idea that with the issues of the global land grab, this idea that large-scale agriculture, investments in large-scale agriculture would somehow solve the problem, and in the environmentalist idea that land sparing, or this idea that if you intensify agricultural production, presumably on large-scale farms, it will leave more space for wilding or for the environment to flourish. So this idea that plantations still as a territorial entity occupy our thinking about possible alternatives. Fourth, the Plantationocene, I would argue, reinserts the importance of agrarian relations in a world in which the rural has always been a partial society or on the margins or awkward in some way. Probably everybody who's here takes the agrarian very seriously and even starts organizing theory from the vantage of the land or thinking through and with the agrarian societies. But the theory that dominates the Western world is so urban and so much based on an idea of transition from the rural to the urban, or from agriculture to industry, or feudalism to capitalism. And so based on a series of dualisms that are indefensible, right? The divide between nature and society, urban and rural, core and periphery, mind and body, and so on. Western theory was really born at a time when it reified this move from rural to urban in its particular theoretical ideas. And so the Plantationocene helps to insert the awkward figure of the land and of the peasant in our theorizing, and I think helps us to understand the difficulties with those dualisms and also the teleologies. Fifth, and very relevant for the conversation today, plantation agriculture represents a particular ideal of subduing and simplifying the land, one with great implications for understanding climate change and environmental degradation. So plantations generated their own ecologies, and as Jason says, one of the underlying logics of the plantation was the separation of man and nature, or humans and nature. And this idea where you could simplify, standardize, and extract is, I think, very much connected to those climate-related crises that we started the conversation with. So research on plantations makes clear the connection between plantations to soil exhaustion. Some really interesting work in geography that links enslavement to soil exhaustion through the plantation. Also connections to deforestation, of course, agricultural intensification with all that brings with it, dispossession, migration, urbanization, carbon, increase in carbon emissions, habitat loss, and the spread of disease. So many of the elements of the climate crisis that we are confronting today really either begin on the plantation or need to be understood in the context of the spread of the plantation. And sixth and last, and I know my time is up now, but the sixth element that is perhaps the most important of all, and I've only left it until last, maybe because of that, but the sixth element that is important and flows from a focus on plantations is the ability to highlight resistance, right? And the possibility of alternatives that need to be analyzed carefully, in part because of that ambiguity or the ambivalence that comes from understanding the role of the plot in plantations. But plantations everywhere have been susceptible to failure, right? They're ambitious, aspirational, and constantly on the verge of failure. Enslaved persons ran away, they killed the planters, they organized for access to land, and occasionally they organized for a complete end to the system, right, for revolution. Today, peasant organizing or rural organizing is some of the most active and politically salient organizing in the world, from movements like the MST in Brazil to indigenous movements to Via Campesina as an umbrella movement. And so the struggle for land distribution, for property size caps and new forms of production and social provisioning, these aren't simple demands to redistribute property, but demands to fundamentally rethink the organization of society. So it isn't about simply getting access to land for the MST. It's about fundamentally rethinking the connection of that land to the impulse of the market and to the impulse of the formal state. The Plantationocene is, of course, a strategic essentialism, but that's what I hear in the MST's slogan or cry of down with the latifundia, right? Is this argument that their inability to access land and inability to create areas of food sovereignty have to do with the control of the latifundia. Sarah Beskey in a recent forum quotes Catherine McKittrick as saying that plantations are not sexy. We shouldn't be talking about plantations just because they are of the moment, maybe. They enter the world always already brutal and they stay that way. This is one of the reasons why I think that the Plantationocene is politically effective. It's difficult to co-opt the term and make it banal, as centuries of reform have done for notions of poverty, even inequality and malnutrition. The social relations of the plantation, and therefore the Plantationocene, are harder to hide. The violence is quite naked and clear. And so our analysis and options, I think, should be as well. Thanks, Fuad.
Thank you, Wendy. You've really both given us a lot to reflect upon. And this next part of the webinar is an opportunity for you to actually have a dialogue with each other. And this can take the form of maybe posing a question to each other, following it up with comments or another question. We'll devote maybe 15 minutes or so to that before we really open it up for discussions. And I want to say here, Wendy, really, this was not really an attempt to emphasize differences, but to try to encourage you to explore, commonalities and maybe think about a common future about how we think about these things in the face of this enormous catastrophic challenges we face. Okay, so why don't I give the floor to Jason. Let's see if you have any question you'd like to pose to Wendy, or maybe a topic you think you could have a mutual conversation about, currently explore.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Wendy, for that great presentation. It's very hard to have a conversation because you haven't actually staked a position on the world historical turning points or the developmental patterns. You've aggregated them from what you see as the side of the real. There's this kind of regional particular or methodological regionalism. And as you know, I've been making this argument for many years that no, indeed, world historical patterns and turning points are themselves fundamentally empirically specific and real. And in fact, one of the weak points of critical geography and critical theory, but especially critical geography, is its inability to conceptualize the world historical as a vital production of space moment or geographical differentiation moment or territory making moment, pick your favorite phrase. But it's very difficult to bridge this gap because you have this regional particularism where and then at the same time you want to have your cake and eat it too, which is to say, well, this is the linchpin of everything. But you actually haven't made that case that it's the linchpin of everything, and it's very, very sort of it's a struggle for me to try to figure out where do we get traction, since much of what we're doing thematically, Capitalocene and everything that you outlined, the racism and the violence and the patriarchy and the everything is absolutely at the core of the world ecology conversation. So I can't help but think that this is the non-Marxist version. There's no capital, there's no class, there's empires, but more as sort of phenomenal descriptions, not as a logic of imperialism embedded in the web of life and class formation and all this. And so sometimes I get uneasy because you criticize the Capitalocene for not doing everything when it doesn't try to do everything. And then you give us a theory of the Plantationocene, which at the end you're saying, well, this is what I forget what you call it, a strategic essentialist or a conception or something. but you don't actually make the argument that the plantation is the linchpin of the major world historical tipping points and transformation. That's what we're doing when we say, you know, we have to understand the origins of the Industrial Revolution through the capital formation of the West Indian plantations, through the genocide and dispossessions of the cotton frontier and all this. So I'm sort of like all over the place. Is this ultimately about Marxism?
It's so interesting that that's the major question that you want to pose about whether or not my Marxism is good enough. I think
that's not what I said. You don't have a Marxism. There's no class, there's no capital, there's no empower.
Okay, well, that's fair. So it isn't what is being prioritized when I talk about the Plantationocene. But I would say that the suggestion, and I would sort of step back and say that I loved your presentation. So I don't know that there is necessarily a reason why we have to say the Plantationocene doesn't fit within an understanding of the Capitalocene. But I would say that there was a historical moment in what I said, right? So the watershed moment of the global spread of plantations that, yes, happens with the colonial spread, the colonization of the New World, and then increasingly the colonization of Africa and Asia. So there is a historicity to it. It is placed at the sort of moment that you identified as the unprecedented spread of plantations. I would also say that I don't think that I have to defend the Plantationocene as a theory necessarily, right? And I said in the beginning, I think it is a concept, it's an idea that helps to illuminate aspects of the, you know, historical period and how it is that we got here today. But an all-encompassing theory of everything, I don't think the Plantationocene is that. I don't think everything derives from the plantation, but that it's an incredibly important historical and ongoing space for us to be understanding the nature of the climate crisis today and the nature of these other crises that we've already referred to. So I don't know that it's fair to say that class relations and capital aren't present. Although, you know, in thinking back on the presentation, I'm not sure that I said class or that I specifically talk about capital, but it's very clear to me that the plantations are yoked to the expansion of capitalism. And that plantations are evident also in economies where capitalism is not yet, or, you know, the dominant organizing force, right? So I do think that plantations in China and the idea of organizing collective farms in the former Soviet Union, or in Mozambique, when you have really different periods of, you know, organizing the economy, the plantation, the large-scale monocrop production is still the constant, right? It's still the form of agricultural production that people idealize and turn to. So I think class relations need to be analyzed in the context of every specific plantation and plantation economy, right? Like, you can't understand the organization of power and politics and market in Brazil today without understanding the weight of those initial plantations and the way those still really influence everything from class relations to the formation of political power.
So if you don't have a follow-up comment to Jason, well, this is an opportunity for Wendy to maybe pose a question for you.
So I guess I would have a couple of different questions, and you've already discussed these, but I would love to hear you elaborate more on them. There was an argument there about how the focus on the Capitalocene, although it's been charged with Eurocentrism, from the perspective particularly of Cedric Robinson, Anibal Quijano, and certainly the Escobar, Mignolo, right? The modernity, coloniality, trinity. And I sort of nod to this, right? When I talk about moving the origin story or the discussion of that watershed moment, right? To the periphery. And your suggestion was that this was not a valid comment about Eurocentrism, or maybe it was that it is a Eurocentric analysis, but that's valid because the engine of production comes from Europe. And I just wonder if you can clarify your particular perspective, maybe particularly on Robinson and Quijano. And maybe
well,
also—
right. So my argument is in alignment, especially with Quijano and to some degree with Robinson, who is really inconsistent, has lots of great insights, but really inconsistent in that book, flipping back and forth between a kind of ontogenetic account of the medieval origins of race, and then and then he moves out of that into very sophisticated accounts where he understands, for instance, that what the English are doing in Ireland is in fact a signal moment of the drawing of the world color line. He criticizes the historian, it's buried in the footnotes, but he criticizes the historian Morgan for seeing racism is only about skin color, when in fact it's about imperial class formation. That can't be forgotten. That can't be forgotten in all this. Sometimes people celebrate Robinson in ways that I don't recognize, and sometimes Robinson says things that are quite at variance with the tradition I identify with, which is a Black communist tradition of C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King in various ways. So this is the super exploitation thesis. And who knows what Robinson would say today. Quijano, I'm with. Mignolo and Escobar are flat out neo-Smithians. They believe that early capitalism is not capitalism. It's simply, what is it that Mignolo calls it? The Atlantic commercial circuit. Escobar is a straight up sort of regional particularist, anti-communist, sees socialism, communism is exactly the same. So there's lots of things here, but the overall move of the political ontologist, Blase is very clear on this, is to replace the category of capitalism, which with Quijano and Wallerstein, I've argued for many years, emerges in the Atlantic world. I published at this until my eyes have bled. And so and to refuse to accept the reification of Europe. Europe doesn't emerge as a real abstraction until this long, cold 17th century. And what's striking is not with you, Wendy, but with a lot of the so-called decolonial thinkers who have lots of great insights. Don't get me wrong, there is such an evacuation of the history of the link between ideology and class and empire. Quijano is very good. So Quijano is, right, he talks about the closed totalities of nature and society, as he doesn't use the term, but as real abstractions. But it's a surprise to me that after literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of making this point, people still want to say, well, it's Eurocentric. It makes me wonder if they know what Eurocentric means, but also the decolonial folks like and political ontologists are often proving the European miracle, because there's nothing to explain the rise of capitalism at all there. So it must be truly miraculous if we can't explain it. So yeah, I mean, it's just a weird sort of, I think it's a weird case of shallow reading or ideologically induced reading, because from the beginning, as you know, Wendy, I've been an anti-imperialist Marxist and a critic of Eurocentrism from day one. But neither would I see it all beginning. I think maybe this is why I was getting uncomfortable. And maybe there is a discussion. It's not all about the plantations. So this is an argument, as you know, that's circulating around extractivism. It's not all about extractive enterprises. It's not all about the power of the bank and the emergence of modern banking and fiat money and all of that. It's not all about, say, the yeoman farmer. It's not all about the mechanization of this great burst of mechanization that occurs between 1450 and 1550, which is quite extraordinary. It's not all about any of these. What we're looking at is the combined and uneven development. So what I hear from you is one thesis that says it's a part of this dynamic, uneven, and combined whole. And then another, which is really, this is the linchpin of everything. And you go back and forth between the two. And maybe that's just part of the necessary process we all go back and forth around.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. And I think you know, if you were to pin me down, I would say that I think that what is more productive is not necessarily trying to figure out what it's all about. And I know you'll suggest that that desire or that slipperiness is maybe theoretical looseness, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily the requirement is to figure out what it's all about. I think it is something, the Plantationocene and the emphasis on plantations is incredibly useful for understanding the sort of things that I highlighted. And I think that the work that it does, you know, corrects some of this sort of desire to understand from a very abstract level the workings of the whole, you know, market economy or world ecology. I think it grounds it in ways that are super productive.
See, but that's your philosophy of what's actually empirically real. And that's what really troubles me, because no, indeed, the regional is one, I mean, region is one side of the real, okay. But so is the early Atlantic capitalist world ecology. That has a real geographical dynamic, has real political specificities, cultural specificities, everything that you would attach to a particular region. And that's what really, really troubles me, because there's this sense, and even in your comments, like, oh, the Capitalocene is like this abstract thing. You know, it's interesting, you cite Latour of all people. Latour never cares about anything specific. And it has all sorts of problematic things. You know, it's one thing if you want to cite Stuart Schwartz or Richard Dunn or some historian of the plantation system that you like against me, okay. But don't say that the Capitalocene is just this abstraction, unless you're going to say that, you know, your construction of the real is equally abstract. Because I mean, hundreds of pages, literally with thousands of references to very, very specific transformations, regional studies, global studies, looking at the patterns. That's neither less nor more real than what you're looking at. And that's what really, I mean, should we be having a discussion around empiricism and the philosophy of what's real and what's not? Because it makes having a comradely debate very difficult. Because I'm a historian and a historical geographer. And when you say, well, this is all abstract, I mean, that shows your philosophical position, okay.
I didn't mean to say that it was all abstract. You definitely do bring in historical information. I was responding to the argument that the plantation isn't what it was all about. That somehow, in order to be able to talk about things like watershed moments and the importance of relations like the sort of long trajectory of racism and the idealization of the plantation production, that I had to be able to say that plantations somehow were what it was all about, right? And describe everything from that set of processes. That's what I was pushing back on. And maybe what your argument is that in order to say that there's a Plantationocene, one in fact does need to be able to say that this was somehow fundamental, or as you said, the linchpin to what it's all about, or to understanding everything. And again, I'm not trying to argue that the plantation itself is the, you know, underpins everything, but that it is this fundamentally important and really does shape the modern area, or does is something that is defining of the modern era.
But then why the polemical attitude towards the Capitalocene, since we agree on that point and have agreed for a very long time, not just in my work, but in many other work, that's where the Capitalocene thesis comes out of. Now, no doubt that you and your comrades have had a remarkably rich research agenda that have unpacked these in all sorts of ways I could never imagine. So I'm not trying to say I nailed it from the beginning, but I'm trying to, it's not just with you, Wendy, it's with other Plantationocene people, that they want to straight up ignore that the Capitalocene comes out of exactly everything that you're talking about. So there's something political going on with this that should be just talked about in openly, and we can have our politics and our political and intellectual biases. We all have them. But for the audience, I think it's very important to make this clear.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that there is, for me, a tendency with the discussion of the Capitalocene, you know, in the same way with the Anthropocene, a specific kind of concern about dating the Anthropocene and finding the specific geological or stratigraphic marker of the Anthropocene, say, right, in order to be able to then say we've accurately defined what the Anthropocene is and where it comes from. And I think, and Harriet sent us this question, Harriet Friedman, to ask us whether or not this discussion about the specific attention to the specific date of the Anthropocene, whether that was distracting from a broader political argument about what we're fighting for and how to effectively fight back against something that is as huge as the climate crisis and underlying poverty and inequality, right? So part of the pushing back against the abstraction to a specific, I agree with the importance of historical materialism and the importance of historical moments and trajectories, but the Capitalocene, and to some extent you probably make this argument about the Plantationocene, right? That when you get to be so broad, if you're not deeply attentive to the particularities and to the way in which those are experienced and lived, then it is an abstraction, and it does do a certain negligence to the experience. Well, now I'm sounding tautological. It does do a sort of a violence to the way that people are going to engage politically in opposing the Capitalocene.
And this
I'm not sure if I tracked that. It's very important, but we can take questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think we only have about half an hour left, and there are many people who would like to join the conversation. We'll begin with actually Harriet Friedman, who's posed a series of questions which I've shared with the panelists and that she'd like to sort of articulate now. So maybe, Harriet, I don't know if you can hear me, but this is a good time for you to join in.
Thanks. Yeah, I just saw how to unmute. I was a little perplexed. Okay. Hi, Jason. Hi, Wendy. Hi, Fuad. Wendy, I am so frustrated that I haven't read your work on the Plantationocene, and I'm so thrilled to hear what you have to say. I'm more familiar with Jason's work, and thank you for bringing up the one question, so I won't repeat it. In fact, I don't even want to ask the other two questions now. I want to ask something different, or just make a comment and ask you to reflect, you both, to reflect on it. As I was listening, this is really a really interesting and constructive conversation, I think. So thank you both. I was thinking that, out of all my work on the history of rural relations within capitalist world economy, now we can call it world ecology, although I wasn't aware enough for a lot of it to do that, that a lot of it has been about recentering the rural places, land, and I think if we added mining in with agriculture, other forestry, other, as Jim Scott has done, other land-based, intrinsically land-based activities, that we can see that the period after the 1950s, I would say, is the one where we got obsessed, or ideas and categories became obsessed with the urban and the industrial. That even in the 1950s, rural sociologists and agricultural economists were starting with land and labor, the categories they inherited from the 19th century, and land just kind of disappeared until it started, as you say, Wendy, and I don't think Jason would disagree. Tell me if you would, that it came from the people, it came from capital. So suddenly, commodity index funds become important to finance. Suddenly, rural social movements become important, from the MST to La Via Campesina. And so it starts to recenter itself. And I think a lot of it came out of this hierarchy of needs things, that supposedly the food problem had been solved. Now we don't think it has been anymore. Maybe started in 1974, that we thought it started thinking it hasn't been solved. the food problem had been solved. Land didn't seem important because industry and cities were centered, except for urban geography. And of course, David Harvey was on that a lot. But I wonder too if Rosa Luxemburg is a helpful figure here, thinker. She was focusing, as I remember it, it's been a while, she was focusing on the autonomy of, or the failure of capital to fully assimilate non-capitalist forms of production, which at the time she was writing would have been mostly land-based and arguably is still mostly land-based. We just kind of forget that in our categories of rural and urban and measurements. So even though she didn't focus on the land, it might be the crucial thing, so that by recentering, I don't think either of you is necessarily going to agree or disagree with all this, but by recentering land, places, ecosystems, landscapes, and the activities that take place on them in our thinking of the history of capitalism, it might, well, that's just what I think is going on here, and I think it's really important. So if either of you would comment on that. I would also say too that in terms of names, I think conceptually, I'm not sure how much it helps, but certainly politically, I don't think it helps to be talking about the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene or any, and the ones I can't pronounce from Donna Haraway or others. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you both, and in advance for what you're going to comment now.
Well, can I just say shortly, the first part of what you said, that's what capitalism as world ecology does. It insists that capitalism as a system of class struggle, of capital accumulation, a militarized accumulation, which is fundamental to Luxemburg's argument and forgotten by virtually everyone talking about the Anthropocene or other scenes today. That all of that is the fundamental the fundamental animating principles of the world ecology conversation. About the last, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, I don't know about the Capitalocene per se. I've always said that's a geopoetics to change the terms of debate with the Anthropocene. But as long as the Anthropocene is around, we're living in a period in the universities in North America. Nobody knows this, but the level of working class rage right now is extraordinary, and especially amongst younger people. They are, under 35. They are willing to talk about capitalism and socialism. And the ruling class, they always know we can dress it up. Like you remember Tom Hayden and Norman Borisage in the 70s talking about the campaign for economic democracy or something like that. We always knew it was socialism. The ruling class always knew it was socialism. So let's just talk about socialism and capitalism in the web of life.
Thanks, Harriet. I wish I could see your video, although you've chosen a video that is evocative of you, so that's fine.
I just want to say I don't see any way to turn on my video. So anyway, maybe you can make it happen, Fuad.
Oh, that's a good point. Well, so let me just, I guess I agree with Jason that I think the Anthropocene, I think that part of the utility of any of these proliferation of scenes, and I agree that they're obscene to a certain extent, right? And that maybe not the Capitalocene, and for me, not the Plantationocene, but certainly the proliferation gets to be ridiculous, right? And but the Anthropocene on its own, I agree, is quite problematic because that Malthusian tendency to sort of see too many bodies as the problem, right? The carrying capacity has been overloaded. That resonates just too much with common sense, right? And so leaving it at the Anthropocene actually seems quite dangerous. And having an alternative that foregrounds class relations, that foregrounds the violence of the way that land has been appropriated, I actually think that's quite productive. I also think, I'm biased in part because that slogan of sort of down with the plantation, it doesn't translate well, but the MST slogan about breaking up the large scale plantations, I think really resonates with not just me and the MST, but with rural movements much more broadly, whether they are movements of workers or of peasants or other making other kinds of livelihoods on land. So I do think it's not a distraction to be talking about how to rethink the Anthropocene with a different concept, right? Because the only way you can really pull apart all the problems is to have some alternative way of thinking about it. So maybe world ecology, is a sufficient frame, but I think the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene are quite politically and analytically useful in that. I agree with you that recentering the importance of the social life of land and ecosystems and landscapes is a huge part of all of this, and certainly of the Plantationocene, and certainly of my own work, really thinking about the material and the symbolic importance of relations on the land. And so the Plantationocene captures this, really centralizes this in a way that I think is quite productive.
Okay, now we'll move. Harriet, by the way, I have no control over the video.
Yeah, I don't know. This is the first time I've ever been on a Zoom that didn't have a video selection. Could I just follow up with one political comment about politics or question?
Okay, if you could make it short so
I'll
we
make
could.
it short. Yeah,
Okay.
Yesterday I was on a call with 350.org, and there are all these fired up people of all ages who are ready to start getting pretty militant, and are definitely centered on justice, environmental justice and so on. So race and gender and all. And so the question is not whether the Anthropocene is helpful, because I agree with your critiques. The question is whether anybody really cares about calling it the Anthropocene except a few intellectuals. I don't know. I don't hear it. I don't hear it in the environmental worlds that I'm in, which of course.
But you do hear man nature, which I mean, Wendy, you said it more brilliantly than I did. But man nature, neo-Malthusian thinking is even and especially in Bill McKibben's 350.org runs throughout that.
Does it? Okay.
I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to me the concern are really practical, like get rid of fossil fuels. That makes sense. Right?
But that's not the problem. The problem is capital.
No, I agree.
The problem is capital and empire, and they're I mean, we see this unfolding right before our eyes. This is the problem with like 350.org. You see McKibben's like op-ed coming out after the sort of NATO Ukraine Russia war, that like, oh, let's like promote green energy as a result. No, the problem is not fossil capital. The problem is fossil empire. I mean, the problem is not fossil fuels, but fossil capital and fossil empire. To quote my friend Andreas Mollum.
That wasn't my point at all. I'm sorry, Fouad, cut me off if it's too much.
I'll give you 1 more minute. How's that?
That wasn't my point at all. My point, I can make it more generally, is sort of the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, is that, as Wendy said, at one point, things don't get named until they've unfolded a certain amount. And I don't even know that socialism is the word that will ultimately happen if we succeed in creating a better world. Capital didn't get named until several centuries after we agree pretty well that it began. So what I'm talking about now is a kind of practical politics, not a theory. Most people don't have it. And I would say they haven't much of the time had it, a theory, to generate the resistance and the understandings that start to get named out of that resistance. So that's the place I think we're at in the world right now, is that things are not fitting in the inherited categories, and not just man nature, but also arguably very provocatively even capitalism. It's definitely around, but it's in such crisis that, I don't know, maybe it'll recover. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Harry.
Wendy, did you want to make a quick comment in response? Or?
No, I think the political question of what is going to unite people in very different positions vis-a-vis the climate crisis, I think that's the key question, and it's a really difficult one. Are either of these concepts going to be what unite people? I highly doubt it, right? It is trying to understand a broader set of political alliances that right now, with the sort of populist authoritarians who are in government, boy, it looks very difficult with Bolsonaro and the specter of Trump. This is a moment to think about what are the political alliances and possibilities.
Thanks for indulging me.
Thank you. So there's a question from Rafael Alexander Mayo. I think both of you are not guilty of this. It's really about theory from the South and how it informs our understanding of whether it's the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene, but a more general question about the relation or the place of, theories from the South in our understanding of the global climate crisis. And then either one of you could make a comment on that, but let's take a few questions together before you do that. There's a question from Crystal Bartolovich. If undergraduates agree that plantations are bad, but still think that capitalism is good, has the necessary work been done toward getting the humans most responsible for ecological damage oriented toward a reparative relation to planet Earth? Then I think this one is specifically for you, Jason. If you could elaborate on your use of the term climate patriarchy, rather than what many contemporary gender theorists would conceptualize as sex-gender matrix. What are objectified abstractions implied by the concept patriarchy and its undergirding biological assumptions? Does this perhaps trip up the ability to trace scientism in world historical force? So why don't we take a few minutes to do that, and there are many other questions. So on the first one about the place of Southern theory, really. Either one of you.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I would say that there's no question that theoretical production still has a long way to go in working more equally and closely with scholars across the global South. I think a lot of, there's a lot of really rich conversation happening and a lot of really rich work coming out of those kind of partnerships. But there are, from the hegemony of English as the spoken and written word in the academy to the different political and economic resources of institutions, there's just no question that that's still a major issue. And I think to a certain extent, I hate to say that there's a silver lining to Zoom, I don't mean that, but there is a way in which being able to communicate more constantly and directly, right, might help us to do some of that work. And we'll see, even as inequality increases to the point, and not only inequality, but also the distraction of domestic or particular fights, right? So colleagues who I have all over the place right now are very much not totally absorbed, but very much fighting on the home front. And so thinking about how to connect all of these different struggles, I think, is incredibly important. I will say we had a group of us who organized a conference, and it came out of the land deals group, and then we turned towards thinking about emancipatory rural politics, and particularly around authoritarian populism, and how could you connect the turn towards authoritarianism from Modi to Trump to Bolsonaro. And I think there's still a lot more to be done there to sort of understand what the connections are and what kind of solidarity needs to happen in order to confront those moves, even as people are being challenged, you know, very much in their home institutions, right? So Bolsonaro in Brazil, one of the first institutions he attacks, of course, is the university. So how do you fight, on the one hand, scarce resources, et cetera, lack of time, because you're occupied with fighting, you know, for your livelihood, at the same time as you make those kind of connections and keep them going and strong. So I think the university has a lot to do to, and all of us as academics, you know, have a lot to do to work more closely with scholars from around the world and activists as well. I mean, I think, yeah, I think Jason would probably agree. Oh
yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we look at Capitalocene and Plantationocene as geopoetics, part of what they share is anti-imperialism. And then also I would say we need to look at the universities themselves, especially in the global north, as absolutely complicit with the permanent war, military, industrial, climate complex. And that's something that we're not supposed to say. And so to the extent that we can break the various blockades and speak out, not just about the dangers of, say, right-wing populism, but also seeing the continuities, Obama, Trump, Biden, regime change politics, you know, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And so to the extent that we can try to break those blockades and practice North-South solidarity against the imperial war machines and the Wall Street, Washington, D.C. nexus and all the rest, the more the better.
So there's a question for you, Wendy, from Vladimir Diaz about how you might reflect on a couple of these points. That the number of farms in the US was cut by 2/3 between 1900 and 2000. While at the same time, the individual average size of farms and the total agriculture increased and so on. Can you see these questions so that I don't have to read them, or you can't see them?
No, I can see them. Now I just have to find it, and
it would save time if I didn't have to read them, so go ahead.
But wait, okay, I see it. So he's just asking, would these observations fit with the general argument? And I think the concentration of land in the United States and the dominance then of large-scale farming operations together, of course, right, with the mechanization, with the, you know, here in upstate New York, you have the mechanization of farming and simultaneously the use of undocumented labor that is very much bonded to these farms in ways, you know, where people can't leave their farms because they could be targeted by the police. So I think even though there are arguments that contemporary large-scale agro-industrial businesses are not the same as historical plantations, that's clearly true, but there are still elements of the labor relation and the intensification of production on the land that are very clear, both legacies and ongoing relations. So to me, that very much fits in. It used to be the case that plantations were exported, and now it's very much the case that plantations dominate production here.
There's a question here that I think it applies to both of you. Could we understand the discipline of assembling labor and land through the concept of plantation as a mechanism by which the Capitalocene takes specific temporal and spatial form? That's the first one. And the second one is, could the plantation plot and the simplified and dehumanizing capitalist ecology it fosters be identified by thinking with, but also beyond the agrarian context?
Yeah, I mean, I think with plantations, it's both and the more that Wendy and I are going back and forth, I think the more that we're understanding, it's not a plantation reductionist. And yet with every one of these new fads that sweeps through, which is a sign of intellectual success, of course, there's that tendency to say, no, it's the plantation that does it. No, it's not the plantation that does it. That's a specific organizational form of webs of life, of human labor, paid and unpaid, of managerial organization, of all these other dynamics. And that's one particular crystallization of land, labor, productive organizations in the web of life. The danger is to see that that's really, that it's a plantation that's really connected to the land and not financial centers, or not offices, or not the River Rouge assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan in the 1930s. Those are all equally but distinctively related to the web of life in all sorts of interesting and distinctive ways, from public health to the organization of labor to how race is organized and all the rest. And I think that if we take that essential insight, that it's not, if we're not looking, and I think that was my discomfort with it, if we're not looking at it as the decisive organization at every point in time, then yeah, it brings all those moments together in powerful ways.
Wendy, there's a go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I like the way Jason put that. And I do think that the plantation is a particular instantiation of the what Jason has been talking about with the spread of and global nature of capitalism, right? Here, the second part of the question that you just read is about the way in which plantations as a particular kind of organizing labor and the land for a particular kind of production. We might think about the parallels between the plantation and say, on the one hand, there's a legacy effect, right? So Catherine McKittrick writes about the plantation and then the prison system. And maybe there's an element there of how the prisons are organized, but it's also that there's a historical labor force that is then, as we know, treated, and that there's a sort of path from the plantation that we have to understand, that racialized capitalism, and how we can then understand what Ruth E. Gilmore writes about, right, with the contemporary prison system and the relationship between the two. So on the one hand, there might be parallels to the plantation in mining, or in things like villagization or seasteading and Ray Crave's work, right? There might be ways that we can think about these as parallels, but also think about these things as having connections between them, in answer to the second part of his question, or their question.
And Fuad, we had the question about climate patriarchy. Can I just give a 30-second response? It's a fantastic question. Let me just say, following the work of Silvia Federici, but also Wally Seacombe and many others, there had to be an ideological mechanism to enforce a specific form of super exploitation in order to ensure women's oppression, which is strategically related to the reproduction of cheap labor power. We forget about this because nobody studies the history of proletarianization anymore, but the rapid acceleration of proletarianization occurs 1600 to 1750, and it's precisely at this moment of the invention of a kind of scientific rationality of world domination, to quote Weber, and it has many different forms. One of them, as we've been talking about, is the racialization of labor. The other is the spectacularly violent gendering of labor and the creation of proletarianization as uneven combinations of paid and unpaid work, always under conditions of domination. And so, and the punchline to all of this is that it occurs in this moment of climate crisis. And it had to occur in this moment of climate crisis in some ways.
There's an important question, I think, about political agency in Annie's formulation here about, if you can speak to the different strategies, each concept, Capitalocene or Plantationocene, asks us to begin with, and areas of agreement in terms of strategy implied by each concept. What are the implications for political agency in terms of where you start with, whether Plantationocene or Capitalocene? Maybe, my guess is from your conversations, you're not necessarily interested in a hierarchy of them in any way, but thinking about their implication with each other. But it does raise this political question that she's articulated here.
Yeah. I mean, Jason, you can go ahead, but I would say, so Annie's basically saying stopping the relations that drive the coal plant for good is maybe different than speaking to and with the agrarian struggles of today, particularly those that are struggling against large-scale production and for a piece of land, right? And that these are perhaps, she says, somewhat different political stakes and priorities. I actually don't know that they're all that different, in the sense that the struggle for a piece of land is the struggle for a different economic system, right? In which that piece of land would be able to provide everything from subsistence to dignified living to a place of one's own or some kind of identity or home, etc. That is threatened by the economic system we have today, right? So I actually think that those two struggles are quite connected, but that maybe it's a slightly different starting point. So the Plantationocene would prioritize or highlight those struggles on the land and those activists who are currently mobilizing around what is this historic concentration of land ownership and highly racialized labor regimes that go with them.
Yeah, fantastic. It's a great question. So my question has been very clear. My position has been very clear for a long time that the Capitalocene thesis and indeed the world ecology conversation is a class struggle analytic. That's an old-fashioned way of putting it, but I believe at the heart of the question of capitalism and justice of any kind is class power. And not, of course, people can handle those words and those concepts in wildly different ways and in some unfortunate ways, and I think in some gifted ways. For me, it's an eductive and dialectical concept that is one that joins, as I've been saying, the questions of domination and exploitation of humans and the rest of nature at its core. So hence the centrality of super exploitation as the normal state of the planetary proletariat, if you will. One of the concepts that I love and that I use very often and in longer talks and certainly in essays I mobilize is Rediker and Linebaug's wonderful concept of the plantation proletariat, where they point out that in fact in the middle, in some of the worst climatological conditions of this long cold 17th century, there is amongst other things the English Civil War, along with many other forms of unrest all across the world from Beijing to Paris. And what the Plantation Revolution does is to bring into existence a transnational multiracial working class. So that for me is fundamental. And yet we still have to build on that. Hence my invocation of the planetary proletariat as proletariat, femitariat, and biotariat. And for those who are curious, you can go to my website and see many essays that unpack these questions at jasonwmoore.com. But what I would like to see is, after years of working class defeat, peasant defeat across the world, of violent counter-revolution and counterinsurgency all around the world, is for radical intellectuals to move from, yes, sometimes we can talk about agency and resistance, but let's talk about revolution and revolutionary transformation. So that's my point about the coal plant. Not that we need to get rid of fossil fuels, that we need to get rid of fossil capital and fossil empire, but the 1% have names and addresses, and as a class, they must be liquidated in order to advance anything that resembles planetary socialism. The alternative, which I've also written about, is a kind of Davos-style transition to a tributary world empire, or whatever you want to call it, but a tributary system with politics in command. This is essentially what we've seen with little tidbits here and there, not just the Great Reset, but like, Pfizer making $23 billion in profits off of a captive market that the federal government has created, bought the goods for, mandated, funded the research and everything. This is the essence of the transition, or the tributary civilization. Let's leave out the other adjectives, but a tributary civilization of politics and command, and where too big to fail becomes the logic of the system. So for me, my answer would be, let's go back to Marx and Engels, not in a textual hermeneutic sense, but to understand that capitalism does create the possibility for revolutionary transformation and the abolition of classes in this wider sense.
Wendy, there are a couple of questions for you from Swarnab Ghosh. Is a Plantationocene concept an attempt to specify a kind of logic? In other words, is a claim that the plantation is the nominal essence of capitalism writ large? And the second one is the concept of the Plantationocene primarily oriented toward the Atlantic world. In other words, how might we think of this concept in relation to other spatial configurations, forms of agricultural production that might enable incorporated comparisons with regions where plantations are not the dominant means of organizing capitalist agriculture?
Well, I think, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to go before too long, but I think the question about comparative historical and contemporary studies of plantations is a good one. And I think that's where the richness of the plantation analytic is the strongest. And the studies today, you know, taking somebody like Tanya Lee, who's looked at plantations in Indonesia, people who look at the permanent settlement and try to understand the relation between large and small producers at that time and the way those played a role in understandings of British colonialism. The relationship between sort of so-called community control over or collective control over land in different places with colonial rule in Africa. I think trying to tease out where there are ambitions for colonial governance in large scale territories with often, you know, Phil McMichael writes about the problem of value chains and the importance of thinking about contract production, right? So even where you have small holders, they're very often connected to or tied to large scale plantations through, you know, supply or other sorts of labor or production contracts. So I very much think that this is not just a framework for thinking about the Atlantic world, but for looking comparatively across regions to try to understand the role of land, but the role particularly of large-scale land control or domination in the shaping of post-colonial or colonial and then post-colonial regimes. The first question, I'm forgetting.
About if it's a logic, there's a certain logic involved in the concept of the Plantationocene.
That's a good question. And I think if I were to say that there was an overarching logic, then to my thinking, then the Plantationocene would be a theory, not a concept. And Jason is probably going to push back on that. And I think you rightly could. I think that the connecting of markets and plantations is what gives plantations their logic, right? But plantations on their own and thinking about them as they manifest in different places, they, you know, a really careful analysis of what interests a plantation serves or who is being incorporated and in what ways and what kinds of livelihoods are being allowed on a plantation, shunted to the side. That ambiguity or ambivalence, again, I think is incredibly important. So I think that they're inserted with a logic into the broader market, but that plantations themselves, for me, it's more useful to think about the dynamics and relationships in and across particular places.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time. And so I just want to thank both of you for this really wonderful and very illuminating conversation. And I, for myself, found a lot of common ground between your perspectives. So this is hopefully a beginning of a continuing conversation that we could have. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for your attendance.
Thanks, Fuad. Thanks, everyone.